Previously on 12,000 Bombs, we covered some background on the United States nuclear program and some current candidates' platforms and why the threat of a global nuclear conflict has never been higher. Today we think about what happens after that and why the devastation of nuclear war is so much greater than the immediate damage caused by bombs alone.
There's no possible way for individuals to package years of food for everyone ahead of time. So if you ask me, what's the thing we do ahead of time is we maybe have fewer than 12,000 bombs on Earth.
That's what we are trying to do, really trying to reduce the nuclear weapon. Yeah.
I'm Lauren Warnicki. A landmark 2022 research paper developed models predicting what could happen in the wake of a nuclear war. Rising soot blocks sunlight, leading to lower temperatures and an agricultural catastrophe, which in some scenarios could mean billions of people dying from famine. It's called nuclear winter. Climatologist Lili studies nuclear winter. In this episode, you'll hear from Xia and theoretical physicist Matt Kaplan, our partner on 12,000 Bombs. He hosted Xia at Illinois State University as part of a companion speaker series. Xia attended Peking University in China and first came to the United States to study climate change interventions at Rutgers University in New Jersey.
After first time, I met with Dr. Alan Roebuck. And at the end of our conversation, he said, well, I have another important issue. I've been spending my whole life on it, which is nuclear winter. That was the first time I heard about this word. He walked me through the history of nuclear winter. And then he said, in the report back in 1980s, like all the experts, they suspect there will be a big agricultural impact after nuclear war. But there's no study like quantitatively estimate what would be agriculture production change after a nuclear war. So he asked me, if you are interested, maybe you can spend some time on this. We don't really have any research funding on this, so all on your spare time. But for me, I'm from China. Agriculture is so important. And right after the Second War, so I know my parents' generation, they have been through really hard time, like starving and starvation without food and everything. So I think it's an important issue to really think about what will happen after, like if there's any climate change through nuclear war, how this will change the whole agriculture system and how this will change our food security. So I spent some time, I started to learn the agriculture model. I started to dig into the climate model simulation, the output, and trying to force the agriculture model. So I think then I have first the paper, it's just about the rice production change in China after a regional nuclear war, simulated, of course, simulated nuclear war between India and Pakistan, so far away from China, but still the climate change due to this simulated nuclear war, how that will affect rice production in China, because rice is so important. It's everyday diet for Chinese. And after that, I gradually pick up the topic, and finally we're getting funding from Open Philanthropy Project, and then we're able to have more climate model simulations with different like war scenarios, and finally I'm able to really have this paper published in 2022. Yeah.
We only have one example of what a post-nuclear war landscape looks like. And I know your paper draws from similar climate events like a volcanic eruption, right? Or the wildfires. Is that right? Or how were the models kind of established, or how do you put a model on something that hasn't ever happened?
That's a good question. I think the model, so first we need to talk about how do we really simulate this nuclear war in climate model, or you can call it Earth system model. So before that, you need to have the scenario, the war scenario. So that's basically most of the work done with Brian Toom. So they have the scenario designed either between India or Pakistan or between US and Russia, and they based on the current arsenal those countries have, and then they design like different level of the wars and calculate based on the population, each country or big cities, the population in big cities, to calculate what would be the black carbon, the soot injected into the atmosphere. Basically, I think people use wildfire events to evaluate the model. So, for example, last year, the Canada wildfire, so people has all the measurements from satellite or from all the observation sites. And then they calculate the total black carbon, and then they try to put it in the model, and then the model will simulate how the black carbon will get raised to the atmosphere, upper atmosphere, how it got transported, and compare with observation, trying to evaluate the model, correct the model.
It's an extrapolation, really. I think the other point was volcanoes, too, is volcanoes and wildfires are putting this debris into the atmosphere. And a nuclear winter is like many, many volcanoes all going off at once. And I'm a computational physicist by training. Running simulations is what I do. Every time I look at these climate models, I'm impressed by just how many pieces of physics they have in them. They're doing whole planet simulations with everything that includes ocean currents, atmospheric currents. And when you look outside and you're, oh, why is the sun kind of red today because of wildfires 1,000 miles away in California? This is the kind of thing that's pocket change for climate scientists today. So I think nuclear winter is a very natural extension of a lot of these models.
If you are one of the few people to survive a large-scale nuclear conflict, it's not over yet, right? That there's still a lot of risk. I think you projected that a conflict between the United States and Russia could ultimately, over a period of 10 years, lead to 5 billion people dying from famine. That seems devastating. And also, what I appreciate about your paper is that it pulls in the potentials of human interaction with that circumstance and what countries unaffected by this conflict might face. So what do we do? Do we start like canning vegetables now? Or should we bother to think about as individuals preparing for something like that?
In the paper, I put different assumptions on human behavior change. For example, if we don't waste food anymore, which can add a certain percentage of calories available, or if we change our diet from meat to more vegetable, that could help as well. To prepare, I don't know. It sounds like a little bit awkward to prepare an event of nuclear war. What can you do right now to be prepared? It's really hard. But for me, stop wasting food. That's the first thing, not just to be prepared for nuclear winter, but just to think about the whole climate change and or our carbon footprint. 1/3 of the food in US is wasted from household. Buy the right portion and make wise choice.
I'm thinking about like drills in the 1960s where school children were told, well, if you just duck and cover, or you just go into this homemade bomb shelter that's under the earth, that you can avoid the immediate death from that impact. But they don't really talk about what happens after that, other than like, oh, I have a stockpile of like Chef Boyardee in my basement and that'll be fine.
Right. The question is, how long do you need that Chef Boyardee to last?
Right.
There's this point that we haven't gotten to, but I'm sure we will, which is just how long a nuclear winter lasts. And if you do an inventory of global food, we grow it, we ship it, we eat it. It's like 2 weeks worth of food is out there on the shelves. And you see this in disaster zones and places where there's major disruptions to the food supply and to distribution. So given that this is a climate effect, this isn't weather, this isn't something that you just wait out like you would the cloud of radiation fallout passing over. I mean, this is a multi-year potentially crisis. there's no possible way for individuals to package years of food for everyone ahead of time. So if you ask me, what's the thing we do ahead of time is we maybe have fewer than 12,000 bombs on Earth.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what we are trying to do, really trying to reduce the nuclear weapon. Yeah.
You point to this exchange in 2021 between President Biden and Vladimir Putin.
In New York, at the UN headquarters, Sunrise brought news of President Putin's words and his threats. He had spoken while leaders and delegates here at the annual General Assembly were asleep. And from the early arrivals,
Prime Minister, what do you make of Vladimir Putin's comments this morning?
Canada, the European Union,
Is it time for NATO to double down, for the EU to double down? He's talking about nuclear war now, sir.
Turkey.
What should NATO do now?
This wasn't the moment for off-the-cuff remarks. Statements came, Western nations in universal condemnation of Russia. No real change there. It was the day, though, for the American president to deliver his key speech.
Well, here he is arriving just now, a little later than planned, and with a speech that has been altered as a consequence of what Mr. Putin has been saying.
And from the podium, he was blunt and he was firm.
This war is about extinguishing Ukraine's right to exist as a state, plain and simple, and Ukraine's right to exist as a people. Whoever you are, wherever you live, whatever you believe, that should make your blood run cold. Because if nations can pursue their imperial ambitions without consequences, then we put at risk everything this very institution stands for, everything.
On the specifics of the Russian nuclear threat, he had this.
We do not seek conflict. We do not seek a Cold War. A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought.
Then from the chamber to the first meeting with Prime
It reminds me of like a very critical movie in the 80s starring a very young Matthew Broderick called War Games.
Greetings, Professor Falcon.
Hello, Joshua.
Strange game. The only winning move is not to play. How about a nice game of chess?
So of course the answer is like maybe not have so many weapons. I don't know that governments are willing to do that right now, are they?
The question was roughly, is there a pathway to fewer nuclear weapons?
If governments knew this,
I think they knew, but
they know.
They know, yeah. But
And still they're like, you know what, we need more.
Yeah, we need at least as many as the other guy.
Right.
And the other guy has as many as we have. And everyone's trying to inch up to stay one step ahead. And that's how an arms race happens. The only progress we've really seen is when they sit down at a table and they agree, I'm going to take apart this many systems. You're going to take apart that many. We're going to adopt this policy. In exchange, you'll adopt that policy. But those are really delicate diplomatic arrangements that even during the worst of times have been very, very hard to, right now, for example, to initiate.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like governments are willing to, at the moment, they're willing to risk 5 billion people dying in order to maintain their stockpiles.
As we nod on the other side of the table for the viewers listening at home.
It's an audio medium, yeah.
Not going
can we talk more about the actual state of a nuclear winter? So the way that I understand it, and please correct me if this is oversimplified or wrong, is that nuclear weapon strike is very, very hot, which puts a lot of stuff on fire, which, similar to the comparison to wildfires or volcano, brings soot up into the earth. And so that reduces light, which lowers temperature and also compromises crops' ability to grow. So I just want you to talk more and better about what nuclear winter means, or what it actually would look and feel like on Earth.
I think nuclear winter, this concept first came out in 1983 when the TTAPS, those three authors, wrote the paper on science. So the basic idea is if there's like a nuclear war, then you target a city with a nuclear weapon and make the city burn. And with all those materials there, after combustion, it has black carbon. And black carbon is a really highly absorbent material. So it will just absorb the heat and also heat up the surrounded air. Then the much warmer air and the aerosol will just self-lifted to the upper atmosphere, which create like a low pressure nearby and will suck all the fresh air into the city as well. So it's just like adding fumes to a fire. So it's getting like the fire is spread and more soot get into the air and lifted really high, higher than the tropopause. So in really high atmosphere where there's no weather events, there's no precipitation to wash the soot out. And in the stratosphere where there's no weather, it could spread out globally. And depends on the size of the war. So the amount of black carbon get into atmosphere will be different. But all the black carbon there will block part of the sunlight. So less sunlight reaching the surface globally, not just over those two nations involved in the conflicts. So it will reduce the sunlight and then it will cool the surface and it will change the precipitation pattern significantly. The summertime, it will be lower than freezing. So basically, there's no possibility for any agriculture. Even
because you're in literal winter all of the time.
It's just winter all the time. So that's why it's nuclear winter. So there won't be any food production anymore. And for us, you can also look at for the ocean, it changes the fishery as well. Not just the land, but the ocean as well. So the whole food supply will just reduce. We're not able to get enough food supply.
Yeah, something I think is so interesting about what you raise is that like the majority of the nuclear powers are all in the Northern Hemisphere.
That's right.
And so the majority of the impact would be over the Northern Hemisphere. So Australia, portions of Southern Africa, Southern South America may be quasi-spared from the climate impact, but then it disrupts the entire global supply chain. There's kind of a trade system of food that we can't really put the toothpaste back in the tube at this point, right? So starving people in the Northern Hemisphere are going to be like, hey, I want what you've got. And what your paper kind of suggests is that we don't actually know if Australia is going to be like, sure, here, have some food, we care about you, or if they're going to kind of lock down their borders and be self-preservationist about it.
If we turned off all the international trade, the food trade, maybe some country can survive, but you cannot stop like people immigrate to those places and you will never know what will happen. Maybe they close the border and what will happen to the refugees and the local people. You have no idea what will happen.
It does go very far beyond a climate model to predict how groups behave. But we have seen all through human history that famines are one of the biggest initiators of strife, both domestic and international conflicts, mass migrations. It puts a lot of pressure on any of these countries, no matter what policies they adopt.
And I can also see a country like Australia being like, y'all brought this on yourselves. We chose not to have a nuclear program.
I'll volunteer another piece of information. And this is risky to do next to the author of the paper. When I read this paper, I take a scientist view of it, which is that this isn't a perfect, immaculate crystal ball. And that's not because of the assumptions of the model or anything like that, or about the science that's being done. It's partly because there are so many variables. The weather at the time that a nuclear weapon goes off determines how likely a city is to burn and how much it burns. The failure rate of certain weapons, the Russian arsenal is very old, and we've seen their conventional forces have been significantly eroded by the corruption in the government. So we don't know exactly what a nuclear war scenario looks like, meaning we can't say this is exactly how nuclear winter will happen. But what we can say is that there's a spectrum of possibility, and these really scary global famine, billions of deaths, are squarely within what's possible and plausible if there's a large nuclear war. And I think that's more important than obsessing over any one specific number, is knowing that this really can happen.
I'm curious, and I don't maybe expect either of you to necessarily know this, but it's a curiosity I have. If the development of new weapons could be better at not killing 5 billion people, like being more direct or targeted in their approach. I know that sounds awful, but if the fallout and the winter are the things that cause the most destruction back on ourselves, by the way, is there a way that these weapons could be developed to do what governments are trying to do with them and not have such a devastating impact?
I think I heard some conversations like more tactic weapons and accurate target, like just military targets instead of like cities or like living places. But also I heard like the first strike people are talking about, if really anyone's going to use nuclear weapons, they are going to target all the targets just on first strike to make them not capable to respond to the first strike. That's what I heard.
So you put all your eggs in one basket,
Yeah.
just blow everything up,
That's
and then
what
it's over.
I heard. But yeah, I'm not expert, so my feeling is definitely they are not going to just use one nuclear bomb and the first time, because that will give time for the opponent to respond and then to continue. So
one of the big risks with hitting cities is that it's important, and I'm doing sarcastic air quotes here in the studio, in a nuclear conflict, to also target conventional forces and things that might be of rebuild value. So that includes infrastructure that supports the military. That's anything from an oil refinery that's producing fuel so you can move stuff around, power plants, electric transformers. All of these things are thought to be targets in the event of a US nuclear war. And many of those are, of course, in industrial areas, which are in and near cities. So even though a city may not necessarily be legal to target because those are civilians, it still happens that cities and these sort of burnable targets are going to be very near where we would expect weapons to go off. So one of these things she mentioned about hitting all of these targets at once, the United States has these 400 silos out west. And part of this, it's thought of that they're a sponge in the event of this overwhelming first strike, that Russia would have to expend so many of its weapons hitting these silos in the middle of nowhere. One thing we saw in the 1950s, and after they sort of hit these really big megaton yields, is the yields of weapons started going down. And it was because they had more accurate delivery systems. You don't need to destroy a 10-kilometer area if you can get your missile to land within a few hundred meters of the thing you want to blow up. You can use a smaller weapon, you can use a lower yield weapon, and it's lower weight, so you can deliver it farther in a rocket. So in principle, more accurate delivery systems enable nations to use lower yield weapons. But then there's also the risk that lower yield weapons make them more attractive as an option to use, because it's somehow more reasonable to use one rather than a bajillion megaton bomb. And that, of course, once you've used one, you do have the risk of this very rapid escalation.
As I mentioned kind of at the beginning, we only have one real life example of what the impact of a nuclear strike looks like, right? There wasn't this kind of ripple effect that you suggest here with a nuclear fall or a nuclear winter. Is that because it was 2 bombs and they were not returned? You know, that it didn't create this back and forth, or did you learn from Hiroshima and Nagasaki that maybe informed the work that you do now?
I think what you said is right. It's only 2 bombs, and the fires, the soot generated from that is not big enough to have this climate consequences. So nuclear winter, the whole theory is based on the amount of black carbon getting into the atmosphere. So this paper is just an example, like Matt was saying. It's a range of possibility. And the number here and what we're showing here is one possibility, and it's horrible. And we want to use this one just to show this is really a bad idea to even thinking about it.
So there's a big range of temperature drops that are described in the paper, whether it's 2 Celsius or this catastrophic 9 Celsius. That doesn't sound like so much. That's like the difference between stepping outside on a chilly day and going back to grab a jacket. But on a global scale, moving those average temperatures by that amount, that changes your growing regions like Iowa into Canada. And so suddenly you don't have suitable growing conditions in these very agriculturally productive regions.
And we already understand that in the opposite direction.
Exactly.
Right?
The global warming. Yeah.
Exactly. So this is also, in a sense, another extension of the climate change modeling for global warming, but in another direction. But let's pick a scenario. Let's pick this 5 degrees Celsius. So that's 9 Fahrenheit, for example. If we change temperatures all year long and just drop them, just take your 70 degrees, move that to 60 degrees, right? That extends your winter on either side by a month, by 6 weeks. That means that your last freeze or your first freeze are going to be much later. So you're compressing your growing season. You have harsher winters. And then you also have these risks of summer snowfalls in July. Could you imagine the 4th of July, it's snowing? This is a real thing that's happened in history after volcanic eruptions. Some of the worst famines in Europe are the results of these volcanoes causing these July frosts at night. And as a result, it all combines to mean less food. So that's what it means for Illinois. If you're here in Normal, Peoria, Champaign, you think, we're not a target. We don't have anything of military value here. I've looked at the maps and I've seen that it would be Chicago and it would be these other military bases. But it means many refugees coming from Chicago and St. Louis to the few places that have infrastructure and solar panels and windmills.
And it means,
not enough.
Yeah, it means
not enough food and
a total collapse of our agricultural industry, right?
There's a very real risk that the United States is these like feudal fiefdoms. And the person who's really administering your life is a county commissioner, because how can a president or a general or a governor actually exercise authority in the aftermath where all of our infrastructure is destroyed? That's what the scenario really does look like. There's no good case for anyone anywhere in the United States.
Lili, how do you sleep at night? And related to that, I think young people, you know, this project is really centered around young people and kind of firing up the next generation to take action on these issues. They are hyper aware of the risks of climate change and the impact that would have on their lives. I do not know if they are quite so aware of this.
I'm a mom. I have a son 11 years old. So I always think about his future. I hope for his world in the next couple of decades, there could be no any of those war scenarios happening or any of those bad things on environment happen. I hope our research can really be well communicated with the public and with the policymaker. And this is the worst probably scenario we have in human history. Just trying to eliminate it, the possibility of happening in the future for our next generation.
Your turn.
What was even the question? She gave such a good answer. I forgot what we were talking about.
How do you sleep at night? And, and I think, and you and I have touched on this before, kind of like, what is the agency of the generation coming up to believe that they can actually affect change around this? It's not an inevitability.
It's not. And to answer your first question, how I sleep at night, the answer is pretty well, actually. But the reason is because I do spend all day working really hard on this issue and others. And it is pushing a boulder up a mountain sometimes. There's a lot of money trying to push us to more weapons and these bigger systems. So it is an uphill battle. But I always tell myself that if we stop fighting this battle and if we give up and we say that, oh, well, this is inevitable, these people are going to do whatever they want, we have no power, then that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The only way the world gets better is if we believe that it gets better and we act in a way that could potentially lead to the good outcome. There's no other way to get the good outcome than to believe and live your life in that direction. So this means, hey, doing a podcast like this and trying to make young people aware. And for the young people listening to this, that means voting. It means thinking about when a candidate says, if we have nuclear weapons, why don't we use them? Taking pause and thinking whether or not that's a scary thing for a presidential candidate to be saying, or whether or not that's the kind of rhetoric that they like and want to hear, and if these risks are acceptable to them.
Have I missed anything?
What's next? You must have more research to do. We've talked about a paper from 2 years ago, but that paper was about the 6 staple food crops like potatoes, rice, wheat, soy, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the others, corn.
No potato.
No potatoes. So are potatoes going to be in the next one? What's the future for nuclear winter research like?
Well, I mean, I think there are, how many? 10 probably, new research program funded by Future of Life Institute and just focusing on the research of nuclear winter. So starting from how to design a scenario and what would be the materials in cities burn and what could be the amount of black carbon generated, and to improve the climate model by including more climate models from different centers global-wise and trying to reduce uncertainty from the climate model simulation. And also there are like 4 different projects on agriculture, food system get involved, trying to use multiple crop models to simulate the climate impact after nuclear wars, and also trying to involve better livestock models and fisheries. So yeah, we are trying to reduce the error bars in our research and trying to send out very loud message to the public and what could be the possible future if we have a nuclear war.
You mentioned you're going to add more agriculture models to these climate models.
Yeah.
Are there new foods that you're going to be studying that there could be shortages of?
Oh, yeah. So one thing our group is working on is trying to add the simulation for coffee and chocolate.
Coffee and chocolate.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I can deal with fewer calories, but
But so many of those calories are already chocolate.
I know that's another reason if like original nuclear war, maybe it won't give you like really a shortage of food supply, but what if it affect the supply chain of coffee and chocolate or wine or beer? So what does that mean to your everyday life?
Then you have a whole bunch of people in withdrawal. They're hungry and they're in withdrawal. 12,000 Bombs is a partnership between WGLT and Matt Kaplan. The 12,000 Bombs speaker series is presented with support from Illinois State University's Office of Research and Graduate Studies. I'm Lauren Warnicki. 12,000 Bombs is produced by Rosalie Truback with operations support from Ryan Denham. Special thanks to Lili Shah from Rutgers University for joining us on this episode. WGLT is Bloomington Normal's public media, part of the NPR network.